Sarah came to after that she had been unconscious. She realized that she had been on a very. She believed that she was killed during the fights on the planet where she were along with her platoon. But as she realized she wasn't dead, apparently the armor did somehow save her life. But the near shock of believing that she was hurt, or at least being killed, made her lose her conscience. And when she came to back, though, she saw her rest of her team members had been killed. She was a sole survivor, but that was not the only thing. She was literally surrounded by Covenant Empire soldiers by who was pointing their weapons against her. And even though that she had her weapon next to her, she realized she would not stand a single chance against at least 10 Covenant Empire soldiers by herself. Despite that, when they told her surrender or being killed, she didn't even make a movement. In fact, she took her weapon and then they pinpoint her even closer and she threw it away. But the soldiers didn't even lower her weapons. But in fact, one of the commanders told them to bring her back to the ship. And even despite that, it happened. She was brought on board on the warships and even placed in. At least she was brought to one of those guards, those prison cells on board the ship. She was in fact was interrogated by at least one of the commanders over and over about her plans, the location of the forces, anything that she could tell them. Even though she indeed knew some of the information that they required from her, she still refused to telling them anything. But that didn't stop them. They tortured her by doing some performance of some techniques and such things that she refused to be described to anyone in years later on, though. But she still refused to even to reveal any sort of secrets apart from her world or the ships that he had. So the commander then gave the order to send it back the warship back to St. Helios, the whole world of the people, so that she could be interrogated even further, perhaps even more severe, in order to gain some of their knowledge. After she was brought to the homeworld of the people, she was immediately put in a prison, and she was not treated well, because even multiple of the soldiers, even other on the guards in this particular prison, didn't even treat her any respect. Even despite she tried to maintain hopefully about to do so. And one of that, she was in fact placed in a cell, but she was not the only one. She was in fact in a prison, in a cell with a female Singhali. She was in a prison in the same species as her captors. In her mind, this was strange. How is it possible for her to be in a cell? She believed maybe that this particular person was maybe an enemy of this, maybe was an enemy for her power, for her people, like a traitor or something. But she was severely malnourished. But she kept trying to keep talking to her last this girl or this woman asked her name when she said her name was Sarah and that she is from a Jew. And that this other woman by the name Han Chavamee but preferred to be called Han. Han was really surprised to even see that a human, was willing to talk to one of her kind as peacefully. But since both were in this prison cell and they didn't have any weapons, and that since that Han would seem to be is at least weak enough to even to stand any chance. But that was the brief moment they talked, because they didn't take long before that Sarah was brought away from the cell to another room to be interrogated for the next 10 hours straight without any break. When she came back to the cell, she was so tired because when she was just thrown in the cell, she literally fell asleep straight on the floor. But when she came back to waking up later on, she was unawake. She woke up on the small bed that was in the cell. Apparently, Han had put her back on the cell bed. She tried to make sure that Sarah was at least good in a good health. But despite this, Sarah still didn't even want to be trusted about this Han. Han was her enemy, but how didn't she treat her as no matter what? Han and Sarah started talking more into the night. It turned out that Han was once a wife to an arbiter by the name Chavamee, who was later murdered, but she was also supposed to be killed. But Han they later revealed to be has survived, and she had been kept alive for all this time. She even revealed that she has been alive for 393 years, despite that her people only lived for over about 60 to 70, maybe 90 years. So Sarah asked her, how is it possible that she has been around for more than 400 years? For merely 400. But then there's another species live for only past even 90. It turned out that after Han had been somehow saved by some other people, she was brought as a target as a traitor, and that since she was one of the severe traitors to the Covenant at the time, in the rest of the Covenant Empire's mind or eyes though, they kept her in suspended animation for the next several centuries as a warning to others not to betray or defect from the Empire, because they would end up serving as a severe punishment as her. She was appeared. They showed her holographic image to those people, to her among the people, among the military, as in a way to bring sure that no one betray the Empire. And since then, ever since, only about a month earlier, before Sarah came to St. Helios, Han was brought out from the stasis animation from the stasis and put in this jail or this prison as to her crime to be finally been charged. Some of the people, some of the most high up in the government of the empire, they felt maybe it was time to release her and let her die in a prison as she should have done years, centuries ago. Despite this, even despite having been over almost more than 400 years old, Hans still remained as her physical strength. But even despite she is never be able to get anything to eat, but she managed to save enough of the food that she gets from the soldiers by trying to save it in much so that to hide some of the food so that she can eat it later on. Even though now she has been had to share her cell with another prisoner. But Hondo, she managed to do this by ending this. She managed to at least to have been saving enough food even for Sarah, despite Sarah was not given almost like any food at all. She was really not even considered to be as a worth of being saved or given in any sort of food. But the high-ups of the government of the empire wanted to keep Sarah alive and long enough so that they could try to extract any valuable information, despite she has refused. She had been brought up to interrogation for a number of times, but still, every time, she had refused. But the government of the high-ups still had not even given up. They tried for the next several years to be extracting information from Sarah. But after being spending 8 years in prison, from the year 2000 to 545 up to the year 2553, both Han and Sarah was hoping one day they could end up maybe leave the prison or maybe end up being put out of misery. But one day when they heard some guards talking about the war between the humans and the Covenant Empire finally ended. Even some of the guards didn't even want to believe it first, but when they heard from the other guards and even some of their high ranking officers actually explained the war was finally over. To Sarah, she believed maybe now when she was allowed to leave the prison and go back to her own people. But then when she realized Earth made High Command United Nations Space Command may had already declared her killed in action. So there would not be any way for her to go back to Earth or any other colonies without being detected. Even shortly after this, the war was said to have been declared over. Both Han and Sarah was in fact released from the prison. They were no longer prisoner of war. So, what would happen to Han and Sarah? Since Han hasn't been around on her own people, among her people for more than 400 years by the time, and especially she was in fact beyond her time. Things had changed, technology had evolved, her people had grown past her, all those who she had known, friends, the family, all gone. But now she has at least one someone that she can rely on, Sarah. Despite Sarah was released, she was allowed to leave the planet and go back there to where any other planet she wanted to. But for some strange reason, she refused. In fact, after spending 8 years in those Sangheli prison, she decided to remain on Helios, with her new friend Han. Han and Sarah tried to maintain their friendship despite their two different species. But despite that, Sarah managed to get with some help from the government to allow Han to get some small house to live in. They decided to live outside of the main capital on the countryside. Both Sarah and Han lived as friends by the time, but just after they had been living as friends for about a year, Sarah had started to fall in love with Han, who had been by that time had been fully recovered, had regained her full strength and physical strength, but also mentally. She had actually fallen in love with her, but there was one problem. She didn't even know if would ever be with someone like her. Not that she's a former soldier, but a human being. Since they're two different species, and they didn't know if they would be a couple, if they would even be accepted in Singhali society after the world. So when Sarah explained her feelings for Han was not even surprised because she somehow sensed that she were in love with her. And even though when Sarah explained this, that maybe that her people would not even accept their relationship, so they decided to keep that as a secret. But after a while, though, they slowly opened up about the relationship among the public. And shockingly enough, many people didn't even bother about this, despite that all had happened. Even despite that, Han may never would have been missed to go back her own time, back in the early 2150s when she was supposed to be killed. But the point about this, though, Han actually decided to be with Sarah, and after all, Sarah had looked after Han in the prison all those years, but almost for nearly a decade. Sarah, though, in her mind, Han was the most beautiful Sangheli as she had ever seen. But their relationship remained strong over this time. Even though that Han had actually admitted maybe that what if that Sarah were trying to reach out to her own people and telling them that she was still alive. But Sarah, she told Han that her people may have already been declared her officially missing in action, but in the unofficially to being killed in action all those years when she was captured, along with her platoon. And even when she would begin back, she would not probably would have not been allowed to go in the public because since the public thought maybe she was killed and that she was went in went in action, missing action, and had running from being killed. So Sarah decided to be with Han on her new home planet, Sanghelios. And just after building had been together for nearly about 5 more years, they decided to at least to get married. They actually decided to have a traditional wedding on Helios. And in fact, it worked. They actually had gained new friends on while they'd been living together. Even though despite that they were living together, they even tried to combine some human customs into their new home, try to maintain some sort of balance between St. Helios traditions customs with human customs, which Han was actually very interested to learn more about humans. Despite having learned so much about from Sarah, she had actually was concerned how they would be as a family, if they would have family of their own. But in fact, Han actually decided maybe they could have a family of their own one day. But even though Sarah herself was quite young, but she wasn't at the moment, she wasn't even in a rush to have family. At least for maybe another couple more years, because since they had just recently got married, she didn't want to rush in to start a family just so soon, which Han really accepted. But after nearly another 4 more years, Han and Sarah had decided maybe it was time to start a family. But then they both had even realized if they would have human children or even Sangheli kids. But they decided to have children of her own people, of Han's people. And since they knew there were some sort of local orphanage in the capital near they lived, they went inside there, traveled there, and asked if it was possible for them to adopt maybe 1 or 2 children. And in fact, it were actually possible. They actually adopted 2 daughters and 1 son from there. Even despite their children was really surprised that their one of the mothers was in fact a human. All the stories they had told by humans are very bad aliens. They had been trying to destroy the Covenant Empire, so they rejected her as a parent. They actually didn't want to have anything to do with her. So all the time when then she came up to them, they stopped talking to Sarah. And she took that seriously hard. Han was actually trying to convince the children that Sarah was peaceful. She was friendly. Even though she used to be a soldier, but she barely and had even saved her life when they were in jail and in prison together for 8 years. Hearing that, the children was realized maybe it was a wrong to judge Sarah for what other people had done. Despite what she tried, she explained that she was fighting in the war for saving her own people. She had only been given orders telling that the Singhalios people, the Singhali, actually tried to exterminate the humans. So Julian decided maybe it was best for to forgive Sarah and try to move on from the past years when this war had happened. So, even after all this, Sarah and Han was really happy to have their children with them together. And if Sarah didn't have survived the battle on the planet those years ago, she would never have met Han in the prison, and Han may have still remained in a prison, or perhaps even lived on the streets by herself, or perhaps maybe even commit suicide even before any of this happened. But Sarah was really happy to have met Han, and Han herself was really excited to at least have met her. But there's a lot of things of all this had happened. Sarah was really excited to be living on a whole new world from rather from the planet that she came from originally. Even though there were some times when she missed that she just could go back home, see her old friends and family, but knowing that she had perhaps even been back when her platoon had been discovered, been wiped out, and that her family and friends had been told that she was among the casualties, and that if they were seeing her coming back home alive, then they would start having a lot of questions and even demanded some answers from the United Nations Space Command if they had any sort of answers why they told her daughter was dead but then was still alive, and that she had been in a prison on St. Helios for 8 years. And now she is married with St. Holly and even have a family with her. So maybe it was maybe the best for her to let her family to believe she was in fact dead. It would only hurt her family, especially her mother, so dearly. Since Sarah and her mother were so close, even when she was growing up and joined the army, which her mother was very doubt about and even tried to talk her out of it. But Sarah wanted to join the military so that she could serve not only her planet, but also in a way to protect her family from any sort of harm. But rather being told by her family later on that this during the human covenant war that their daughter had perished in a war. And she could even not allow to reopen those old wounds and those hurt feelings of her family to see that their daughter was in fact alive all along. So that is one of the reasons Sarah didn't want to give up to ask the government to be able to leave or maybe go back, since she was allowed to leave the planet at any point she wanted. But she didn't. And for that she decided to stay on St. Helios with her wife and their new children together. Even despite that happened, though, Helen was really happy to at least that Sarah had decided to stay there with her. If she had left the planet when she was allowed the first time, maybe then she wouldn't have ended up marrying with Han, and Han would maybe have just lived for herself. Both was actually very happy that they met in a prison all those years ago. Even when the most perfect moment when they did, and also that they actually gained each other's trust even back then. Because if they had even done it, they probably would have either killed each other during in the fights in the cell. But Sarah was happy at least that never happened, and she was just really happy to be with someone like Han. And Han is about the same thing. And this is how Han, Chavamee, and Sarah found a true love got a family together. The end.